In a small American town, a young African-American surgeon saves the life of a powerful businesswoman. But when she wakes up, she explodes in anger when she sees the wrong doctor. Racism, intrigue, and a lawsuit threaten to destroy his career as secrets from her past surface. Will truth overcome prejudice, or will justice be served? The night was thick with tension in Rockwell, Georgia, a small town where the hum of cicadas usually drowned out the quiet streets. But tonight, the sharp wail of an ambulance pierced the air, racing toward Mercy Hill Hospital. Inside the emergency room, Dr. James Harper, a 32-year-old surgeon with steady hands and a sharper mind, scrubbed in under the harsh fluorescent lights. His dark eyes flicked to the clock, 11:47 p.m. As nurses bustled around him, their voices clipped with urgency. The patient was Eleanor Crowe, a 48-year-old business tycoon who owned half the retail stores in town. She'd been rushed and clutching her side, her face pale and slick with sweat, a textbook case of appendicitis teetering on the edge of rupture. James didn't flinch. He'd seen worse. Car accidents, gunshot wounds from bar fights gone wrong, heart attacks that hit without warning. This was routine, or so it seemed. "Prep the ore," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the controlled chaos. The nurses nodded, wheeling Eleanor in as monitors beeped in a frantic rhythm. She was barely conscious, muttering something incoherent about standards before slipping under the anesthesia. James didn't have time to dwell on it. He sliced in her abdomen with precision, removing the inflamed appendix just as it began to leak, a ticking time bomb defused with seconds to spare. Hours later, he stitched her up, peeled off his gloves, and exhaled. She'd live, better than live, she'd recover fully. Another win for the chart. But the victory was short-lived. By morning, Eleanor was awake in the recovery room, her sharp green eyes narrowing as James stepped in to check her vitals. The air shifted, heavy with something unspoken. "Good morning, Ms. Crowe," he said, his tone steady as he scanned her chart. "The surgery went well. You're on track to—" He didn't finish. She cut him off, her voice a venomous hiss. "Who are you?" Her gaze raked over him, lingering on his dark skin, his neatly pressed scrubs, the stethoscope around his neck. "Where's the real doctor?" The room froze. A nurse in the corner, Sharon, flinched, her pen hovering over a clipboard. James felt the words hit like a slap, but he'd heard them before. Different faces, same venom. He straightened, meeting her glare. "I'm Dr. James Harper. I performed your surgery. You were critical, but you're stable now." His voice didn't waver, though inside, a spark of anger flickered. Eleanor's lips curled into a sneer. "You? I didn't ask for you to touch me." She yanked the blanket up, as if shielding herself from him. "I want someone else. Someone who knows what they're doing." Sharon stepped forward, hesitant. "Ms. Crowe, Dr. Harper saved your life. The surgery was—" Eleanor snapped her head toward her. "I don't care what you say. I feel worse than ever, and I know why." Her eyes locked back on James, accusing, unyielding. "Give me the director. Now." James nodded once, his face a mask of calm. "I'll inform Dr. Green," he said, turning to leave. But as he stepped into the hall, Eleanor's voice chased him, sharp and loud enough for the whole ward to hear. "You think I don't know what this is? I'll have your job for this." The corridor buzzed with whispers as he walked away, nurses exchanging glances. James kept his head high, but the weight of her words settled into his chest. He'd saved her life, pulled her back from the brink, and still, all she saw was the color of his skin. In the staff room, he leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment. Sharon slipped in behind him, her voice low. "She's been like that since she woke up. Called you, well, you can guess." James gave a tight smile. "Yeah, I can." She hesitated, then added, "I heard her muttering about standards before the surgery. This isn't new for her." James opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. "Doesn't make it easier." He'd faced it before. Patients who flinched at his touch, colleagues who questioned his credentials despite his flawless record. But Eleanor Crowe wasn't just any patient. She was powerful, connected, the kind of woman who could turn a whisper into a wrecking ball. And now, She'd set her sights on him. The pager on his hip buzzed. Dr. Mary Green, the hospital director, summoning him. He straightened, steeling himself. Whatever came next, he'd face it head-on. But as he left the room, one thought lingered. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights of Mercy Hill Hospital buzzed faintly as Dr. James Harper stood at the nurse's station the next morning, flipping through Eleanor Crowe's chart. Her vitals were textbook, pulse steady, incision clean, no signs of infection. By all accounts, she should have been grateful, or at least civil. Instead, her voice echoed down the hall like a storm rolling in. "I know he did something to me," she shouted, loud enough to make a passing orderly jump. "I've never felt this bad in my life." James clenched his jaw, forcing his focus back to the numbers. She was healing. The pain she claimed was normal post-op discomfort, nothing more. But Eleanor wasn't interested in facts. Nurse Sharon slid up beside him, her voice a whisper. "She's been at it since dawn. Called you incompetent to anyone who'll listen. Now she's demanding a new doctor." James nodded, unsurprised. "Let her yell. I got other patients." But as he turned to leave, a shadow loomed in the doorway. Richard Bailey, a slick lawyer in a tailored suit, his glasses glinting under the lights. He carried a briefcase and a smirk that said trouble. "Dr. Harper," he drawled, extending a hand James didn't take. "I'm representing Ms. Crowe. We need to talk." James crossed his arms. "About what?" Bailey's smirk widened. "She's filing a complaint. Says you botched her surgery. We're looking at negligence, maybe malpractice." The air thickened. Sharon froze, her pen hovering mid-note. James kept his face neutral, though his pulse ticked up. "The surgery was clean. She's recovering fine. Check the records." Bailey shrugged, unfazed. "She doesn't feel fine, document. That's what matters. Perception's everything in a courtroom." He leaned in, voice dropping. "She's got influence. You sure you want to fight this?" James met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm sure I did my job." Bailey chuckled, stepping back. "We'll see. She wants you gone by week's end." With that, he sauntered off toward Eleanor's room, leaving a chill in his wake. James exhaled, rubbing his temple. He'd dealt with difficult patients before, but this was different. Eleanor wasn't just angry. She was weaponizing her status. He headed to Dr. Mary Green's office, the hospital director, to report the threat. Mary, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair, listened intently as he recounted the exchange. "She's bluffing," Mary said, tapping a pen on her desk. "Her chart's spotless. She's got no case." James nodded, but his gut twisted. "She doesn't need a case. She's got money and a loud mouth." Mary's eyes softened. "We'll back you, James. Don't let her rattle you." But the rattling had already begun. Later that afternoon, Sharon pulled him aside in the break room, her expression tight. "I overheard Bailey on the phone. He mentioned something about Eleanor's past, a lawsuit she dodged years ago. Sounded like discrimination, but he clammed up when he saw me." James frowned, gears turning. "Discrimination? Against who?" Sharon shrugged. "Didn't catch that part. But she's got history, James. This isn't random." He leaned against the counter, staring at his coffee. If Eleanor had a pattern, this wasn't just about him. It was personal, rooted deeper than one surgery. The twist came that evening. James was finishing rounds when Mary called him back to her office, her voice urgent over the intercom. He arrived to find her hunched over a laptop, a grainy scanned document on the screen. "Look at this," she said, sliding it toward him. It was a court filing from 2013, Eleanor Crowe versus Thomas Red, a black employee she'd fired from her flagship store. The claim? Racial bias. Red had accused her of calling him slurs and tanking his career over a minor mistake. The case settled out of court, hushed up with a fat check. James's stomach sank. "She buried it," Mary said. "But it's real. And now she's coming for you." He stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. Eleanor's rage wasn't just prejudice. It was a reflex, a defense mechanism triggered by anyone who challenged her control. He'd saved her life, but to her, he was a threat, a reminder of the power she couldn't wield over him. "She's done this before," he said, voice low, "and gotten away with it." Mary nodded grimly. "Not this time. We got proof now." If she pushes, we push back harder. James met her gaze, a flicker of resolve cutting through the exhaustion. Good, because I'm not backing down. As he left the office, the hospital hummed around him, beeping monitors' soft footsteps, the rhythm of life and death. But in his mind, the storm was brewing. Eleanor wasn't just a patient anymore. She was a predator, and he was her prey. Only this time, he had a weapon, the truth. And he'd wield it like the scalpel he'd used to save her. The Rockwell County Courthouse smelled of old wood and stale coffee, its high ceilings amplifying every whisper as Dr. James Harper sat in the defendant's chair. It was a sweltering July morning, the kind where the air clung to your skin, but inside the tension was thicker than the Georgia heat. Across the room, Eleanor Crowe sat ramrod straight, her green eyes boring into him like daggers. Her lawyer, Richard Bailey, paced before the judge, spinning a tale of gross negligence that made James's stomach churn. Dr. Harper failed my client, Bailey declared, voice smooth as oil. She's endured unbearable pain, a botched procedure. Her life nearly lost to incompetence. The gallery murmured, a mix of townsfolk and reporters scribbling notes. James kept his face stone still, hands folded on the table. He'd prepped for this with Dr. Mary Green and the hospital's legal team. Hours of combing through records, rehearsing testimony. His work was flawless. Eleanor's surgery had been a textbook success, her recovery on track despite her theatrics. But Bailey didn't need facts. He had Eleanor's word and her wealth, a dangerous combo in a small town where her name carried weight. She trusted Mercy Hill, Bailey continued, gesturing dramatically, and they gave her him. The emphasis on him hung in the air, unspoken racism dripping from it. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. The hospital's attorney, Clara Dunn, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense bob, stood to counter. The evidence is clear, she said, her voice cutting through Bailey's bluster. She presented charts, scans, testimony from nurses, sharing among them, detailing every step of the procedure. Dr. Harper saved Ms. Crowe's life. Her claims are baseless, her pain exaggerated. The judge, a stern older man named Hargrove, peered over his glasses, scribbling notes. Eleanor shifted, her lips thinning, but stayed silent. For a moment, James thought they had her, until Bailey smirked and called her to the stand. Eleanor took the oath with a trembling hand, playing the victim to perfection. I woke up in agony, she said, voice quivering. I knew something was wrong. He didn't care. He just wanted me out of there. Her eyes flicked to James, accusing. I've never trusted people like him. The gallery gasped, and Judge Hargrove's pen paused. Clara objected. Prejudice isn't evidence. But the damage was done. Bailey leaned back, satisfied, as whispers rippled through the room. James felt the weight of every stare, the familiar sting of being reduced to like him. But he held steady, trusting the truth. Then came the twist. Clara called a surprise witness, a last-minute addition unearthed by Mary's digging. Thomas Red shuffled to the stand, a wiry man in his 60s with deep lines etched into his face. His hands shook as he swore in, but his voice was firm. I worked for Ms. Crowe in 13, he began. Manage her main store. She fired me after a cash register glitch, called me a thief and worse. Said I didn't belong near her money. The courtroom stilled. I sued her for discrimination. She paid me to shut up, but I never forgot. Eleanor's face went white, her composure cracking. That's a lie, she shouted, half rising. Bailey grabbed her arm, hissing for her to sit, but the outburst echoed. Thomas kept going. She ruined me. Blackballed me in Rockwell. No one hired me after. I saw her do it to others too, anyone who didn't fit her standards. He looked at James, eyes steady. She's doing it again. I couldn't stay quiet this time. The gallery erupted, reporters scribbling furiously. Judge Hargrove banged his gavel, demanding order, but the air had shifted. Clara pressed the advantage, submitting the old settlement papers Mary had found. Ms. Crowe has a history of targeting people based on race, she said. This isn't about surgery, it's about her. Eleanor's mask slipped. He's lying. she yelled, pointing at Thomas. "They're all lying to protect him." Her voice cracked, raw with fury, and Bailey's polished facade faltered as he tried to rein her in. James watched, heart pounding. Thomas's testimony wasn't just a defense. It was a mirror, reflecting Eleanor's past into the present. The judge's frown deepened, his pen moving again. Bailey scrambled, claiming Thomas was irrelevant, but the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with doubt, Eleanor's credibility crumbling. As the session broke for recess, James leaned back, exhaling. Mary slid into the seat beside him, her voice low. "She's unraveling. We got her now." James nodded, but his eyes stayed on Eleanor, who glared back, unrepentant. Thomas's words lingered. He wasn't alone in this fight. The truth was clawing its way out, and for the first time, James felt the tide turning. But the war wasn't won yet. The Rockwell County Courthouse felt smaller as the trial resumed, the air thick with anticipation. Dr. James Harper sat at the defense table, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside. Across the room, Eleanor Crowe gripped the edge of her seat, her face a mask of barely contained fury. The gallery hummed with restless energy, reporters, townsfolk, even a few hospital staff who'd slipped in to watch. Judge Hargrove's gavel cracked through the noise, silencing the room. "Order," he barked, his voice gravelly. "We'll hear closing arguments." Richard Bailey stood first, smoothing his tie with a practiced air. "My client trusted Mercy Hill," he said, his tone slick. "Dr. Harper failed her, left her in pain, and now they're hiding behind records to dodge accountability. She deserves justice." His words were polished, but the cracks in Eleanor's story, exposed by Thomas Redd's testimony, hung over him like a shadow. The gallery shifted, unconvinced. James caught a few skeptical glances aimed at Eleanor, who stared ahead, lips pressed tight. Clara Dunn rose next, her voice sharp and unwavering. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, holding up Eleanor's pristine medical file. "Dr. Harper saved Ms. Crowe's life. Her claims are fabrication, driven not by facts but by prejudice, a pattern she's repeated before." She gestured to Thomas's settlement papers, now exhibit. "This isn't about negligence. It's about her refusal to accept care from a man she deems unworthy. The truth is clear. Dr. Harper did his job, and she's punishing him for it." The judge's pen scratched across his notepad, his brow furrowed. James watched Eleanor as Clara spoke. Her hands trembled, her composure fraying. When the judge called for her final statement, she stood, ignoring Bailey's whispered plea to stay calm. "I know what I felt," she snapped, voice rising. "He didn't care about me. He wanted me gone. I built this town, and they let him ruin me." The outburst drew gasps. Judge Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Crowe, control yourself," he warned. She sat, fuming, but the damage was done. Her venom had poisoned her own case. The recess stretched into an eternity, the courtroom emptying as Hargrove deliberated. James stepped outside, the humid air hitting him like a wall. Mary Green joined him, her expression tense but hopeful. "She dug her own grave in there," she said. James nodded, staring at the horizon. "Maybe, but it's not over till he rules." Back inside, the gallery buzzed as Hargrove returned. "I've reviewed the evidence," he began, his tone measured. "The plaintiff's claims lack merit. Medical records show no negligence. Testimony reveals a history of bias, not malpractice. Case dismissed." A ripple of relief swept through James's side of the room. Eleanor's face crumpled, her fists clenching as Bailey muttered something in her ear. The gallery erupted. Reporters dashed out, phones already buzzing with the scoop. James exhaled, the weight lifting though not entirely. Clara clapped his shoulder. "You're clear," she said, grinning. But as he met Eleanor's glare, pure, unfiltered hate, he knew this victory came with scars. The fallout hit fast. By evening, Rockwell's papers screamed headlines. Crowe's lawsuit crumbles. Racism exposed. Thomas Redd's story fueled the fire. Old employees crawling out to corroborate her past. Her store saw boycotts overnight. Pickets sprang up, locals turning away from the woman who'd once ruled their wallets. Her empire teetered, her influence evaporating. At Mercy Hill, James walked the halls to quiet applause. Sharon hugged him, eyes shining. "You did it, document." He smiled faintly. "We did." But later, in Mary's office, the triumph felt hollow. "I'm glad it's over," he said, sinking into a chair. "But it's exhausting, proving myself over and over." Mary leaned forward, her voice firm. "You shouldn't have to. But you won, James. Not just for you. For everyone she's hurt." He nodded, the words sinking in. Outside, the town buzzed with the scandal. Eleanor's name now a cautionary tale. James stepped onto the hospital roof, the night sky sprawling above. He'd beaten her, but the fight had taken a toll, a quiet ache he couldn't shake. The next day, a small crowd gathered outside Mercy Hill. Patients, colleagues, even Thomas Redd, holding signs, "Thank you, Dr. Harper." He stared, throat tight. "They're with you," Mary said, appearing beside him. "Use this. Make it mean something." James nodded, resolve hardening. Eleanor had lost more than a case. She'd lost her power. And he'd gained something greater, a voice louder than her hate ever could be. The sun rose over Rockwell, Georgia, casting long shadows across Mercy Hill Hospital's quiet parking lot. Dr. James Harper stood at the edge of the roof, coffee cup in hand, watching the town wake up. It had been a week since the courtroom victory, but the echoes of Eleanor Crowe's defeat still rippled through the streets. Her stores sat half empty, for sale signs popping up like weeds. The local paper ran a follow-up. Crowe's empire collapses amid scandal. James didn't gloat. He wasn't wired that way, but the justice of it settled into him, a quiet balm on wounds that hadn't fully healed. Inside, the hospital hummed with its usual rhythm. James moved through rounds, checking charts, cracking a rare smile as a patient thanked him. The staff had shifted too. Nurses like Sharon met his eyes with newfound respect. Orderlies clapped his back in passing. But the wait lingered. Late that afternoon, he slipped into the break room, needing a moment's peace. The TV flickered with a news segment. Eleanor, stone-faced, dodging cameras outside her shuttered flagship store. "No comment," she snapped, her voice a ghost of its former bite. James muted it, staring at the screen. She'd lost everything: money, power, pride. Part of him pitied her, but the bigger part knew she'd built that ruin herself. Mary Green found him there, her gray eyes sharp but warm. "You're brooding," she said, sliding into a chair. James shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Just thinking. It's over, but it doesn't feel finished." She nodded, understanding. Battles like that don't end clean. They leave marks. He met her gaze, voice low. "I keep wondering why it's always a fight. I save lives. Shouldn't that be enough?" Mary leaned forward, firm. "It should. But people like her see what they want to see. You prove them wrong, James. That's what sticks." Her words lingered as he left the room. Outside, Thomas Redd waited by the nurse's station, hat in hand. "Doc," he said, voice rough but steady. "Heard you're speaking at that medical thing next month. Wanted to say, keep it up. What you did, it's bigger than her." James paused, surprised. "You're coming?" Thomas grinned faintly. "Wouldn't miss it. You gave me my voice back, too." They shook hands, a silent pact between men who'd faced the same storm. That night, James sat in his small apartment, the glow of a laptop illuminating his face. He'd been invited to a regional medical conference. Topic: bias in healthcare. At first, he'd hesitated, the exhaustion still gnawing at him. But Thomas's words, Mary's faith, the crowd's signs, they'd shifted something. He typed a speech, slow at first, then faster. "We don't choose these fights," he wrote, "but we choose how we face them. I've carried the weight of hate, but I've also carried the truth. And that's stronger." By dawn, it was done, a call to action, a promise to keep pushing. A month later, he stood at the conference podium, hundreds of eyes on him, doctors, students, advocates. The room was silent as he spoke, his voice steady, resonant. "I'm here because I had to be," he said. "Not just for me, but for every patient who's doubted, every doctor who's judged. We can't erase prejudice, but we can outlast it." Applause thundered, and for the first time in weeks, James felt the ache ease. Backstage, Mary grinned. "Told you, you're a voice now." He smiled, tired but real. "Guess I am." Across town, Eleanor sat alone in her dim office, the last of her empire boxed up. The phone didn't ring. The town had moved on. She stared at a crumpled newspaper, James's face on the front page, and her hands shook, not with anger now, but regret. She'd fought the wrong war and lost more than she'd imagined. The silence was her sentence, a solitude she'd earned. James returned to Mercy Hill the next day, slipping into scrubs like armor. A new patient waited, an elderly woman with a warm smile, no trace of judgment in her eyes. "Heard about you," she said as he checked her chart. "Proud to have you, doctor." He nodded, gratitude swelling. The scars remained, but they'd forged something unbreakable. Outside, Rockwell buzzed with life, and James stepped into it, head high. The fight wasn't over, not really, but he was ready. Stronger. And this time, he wasn't alone.